Good evening, everyone. My name is Pavlo Levi. On behalf of CREES, Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies here at Stanford, we should welcome you to this year's Alexander Dallin Lecture. This is one of the biggest events we organize annually through CREES. The Dallin Lecture series was founded in 1998 to honor Professor of History and Political Science, Alexander Dallin, founder of the Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies here at Stanford, and a longtime director of our center. The lecture is funded by a special endowment shared by CREES and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Past Dallin lecturers have included many noted scholars in the fields of Russian, East European, Eurasian Studies, and among them Lilia Shevtsova, Dmitry Trenin, Fyodor Lukyanov, Timothy Colton, Archie Brown, and most recently, Misha Yampolsky. Tonight, we have another renowned scholar with us, Volodymyr Dubovyk, and here to introduce him is Gail Lapidus, Senior Fellow Emerita at the Institute for International Studies at Stanford, and Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. Yeah.
Thank you, Pavlo. It's my pleasure and my privilege, really, to be able to introduce our speaker this evening. I think the size of this audience is testimony to the interest of this entire topic and the importance of the whole subject, because Russia's invasion of Crimea and its activities in supporting separatist movements in eastern Ukraine constitute the most serious challenge to international security since the end of the Cold War. And we are very fortunate to have with us to discuss the situation Volodymyr Dubovyk, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at the Odessa National University and Director of their Center for International Studies. He earned his undergraduate degree in history there and his PhD in political science and international relations. And his teaching and research interests include U.S. foreign policy, U.S.-Ukrainian relations, theories of international relations, Black Sea, regional security, conflict studies, and foreign policy of Ukraine. He's held fellowships at a number of major institutions elsewhere, but particularly in the United States. He's been a Fulbright scholar here, visiting scholar and instructor at the University of Washington, and he's been a member of many of the major international organizations and professional associations dealing with post-Soviet affairs. So please join me in welcoming our guests for what I hope will be a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Pavel, for your introduction. I appreciate the nice and kind words that you had for me. I should say before I go on to the subject of my talk today that I have been privileged to meet Alexander Dallin, of course, and you, Gail, when you came to Odessa back in 1994, 20 years ago. I think about this time of year, actually, fall that year, we have had a Odessa 200 conference there. Which was dedicated as a bicentennial of the city of Odessa, and of course Professor Dallin and Professor Lapidus were guests of honor, and I was touched and impressed by his in-depth knowledge of the subject, of the region, of his intelligence in many ways of that word, including the one that we with the Ukrainian or Russian say intelligentность, really a special feature of how you treat people and deal with people. And I was touched myself by the fact that I was only myself 2 years at that point of time, fresh from the student bench, and Alexander approached me as his colleague. There was no snobbish attitude whatsoever, so that was a good lesson to me that I have with me up to the present day in my career. That it's not a matter of age, really. It should be more democratic, it should be more flexible, and it should be more collegial in our academia community, in fact. And I was happy to stay in touch with Gail over these years, and including doing a couple of talks for the groups of Stanford alumni that Gail brought to Odessa, including the one this year, in early June of this year. And that was a very special occasion, and I know of some hesitations that the planners of the trip had as to come to Odessa or not, because it was, after all, 1 month later, tragic events in Odessa, which took place on May 2nd. And also the whole country of Ukraine was in turmoil. Crimea was just taken over by Russian Federation, so there were some considerations as to whether Odessa should be even visited, indeed. And I'm glad that they did, and I know that many people like that tour and like visit to my hometown of Odessa, and I'm looking forward to more people coming overseas to Ukraine, to Odessa from Stanford and elsewhere. We're always there for you, waiting to host you and waiting to provide you with some expertise and some information that we are able to share. Now, having said that, it's a great honor for me to be delivering this Alexander Dallin Memorial Lecture today. The region that Professor Dallin has spent has given his life to, studying the post-Soviet area now, is absolute turmoil. It's an unsettled region indeed. Reverberations are heard and seen throughout the world. In fact, it's not only about Ukraine, it's not only about post-Soviet space. It's much broader. It has to do something with the future of Europe. It has to do something with the future of Euro-Atlantic community. It has something to do with the future of global leadership of this country, the United States. So it has a lot of aspects and a lot of implications. What happens in Ukraine, around Ukraine, and so on. The crisis, which we often call Ukraine crisis, I don't particularly like that term. Specifically, even less I like the terms when the people are mentioning crisis in Ukraine or Ukrainian crisis, because right away you're immediately given this impression, if you use those definitions and terms, that this is specifically a domestic crisis, that it is a crisis which has at roots some contradictions and confrontations in between various groups of Ukrainians. And we had our differences in views, and we had some of the problems in understanding between various regions within Ukraine, but not to the extent that would bring us to the civil war. So the external intervention was extremely important in that case in terms of explaining what is going on in Ukraine, and I'm going to go back to this in my talk as well. The conflict should be called a conflict around Ukraine, a conflict over Ukraine, whatever you like, but there is a conflict. It's not a crisis even anymore. You know, that's another thing where crisis probably misfitting a little bit because it's through crisis already stage, it's a conflict stage already. So it's a big issue now, how do we even call this? And this is kind of a unique situation that we're facing there. The challenges that Ukraine is facing as a country, as a nation state, are numerous, manifold. All of them are existential. There are in various realms of our life. They are in political life, they are in social life, they are in economics, and obviously because of a fighting which is still going on as we speak, even though there is a so-called ceasefire, but people are dying every day there on the front line in Ukraine, in the eastern parts of Ukraine. There are obviously challenges that we're facing in the field of national security, foreign policy, defense policy, and so on. Let me start from politics before I move on to economics and then the actual aspect of the war being going on. The politics in Ukraine have been known for a lot of corruption, political corruption, and just petty corruption, economic corruption as well. Right now we're trying to clean up our act to fight corruption, to finally implement reforms that have been delayed for a long, long time. There have been a talk about reforms, very few have been implemented, many of them not persistently enough, many of them were just initiated and never really developed. So clearly Ukraine right now has a chance of going forward and carrying on those reforms and moving with those reforms. We've just had parliamentary elections. You know, it seems like there have been a lot of elections in this recent week or so. We've had ours on October 26th. You had yours just several days ago here as well. Decision Day, America, 2014. So, and also the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, they had their own elections as well just a few days ago, which were clearly in violation of the Minsk agreement and the peace process that Ukrainian government is engaged in it. But that's what it seems being going on around the globe. People are having elections. You know, in Ukraine, the parliamentary elections. That is our chance to be moving in the right direction. Am I super optimistic about what's going to happen because we've had those? Not. I would be cautiously optimistic, though. It's clearly a chance for us to move forward, because we've got this opportunity to clean even the core of the deputies of parliament. 1/3 of new members of the new parliament have never been members of parliament, have never been actively involved in the political process even, which is seen by many Ukrainians as a good thing. Because after all, it's a discredited parliament, it was a discredited party of power indeed, and Ukrainians wanted new faces and new blood in a good way of that word, becoming into Ukrainian politics. And that's what we're having right now. Of course, there are still some people around who've been around in various governments and so on. So the illustration that we're having, the cleaning of the government, of the public officials' positions from those who occupied those positions previously, is not final, is not total, is not comprehensive. The only country in Eastern Europe, as you know, since the communist times that have implemented total 100% lustration was Czech Republic at some point, and that's it. Ukraine obviously is not going to go that way, because there were a lot of people who were involved in political life. And for example, our current president, Mr. Poroshenko, who is the president right now, he was a high-level politician himself, and he was a member of government, of a cabinet of ministers of Ukraine under ex-president Yanukovych. So if you push it too far, the illustration process, then even Mr. Poroshenko is ineligible, not qualified to be occupying the position of the president. So it should be some kind of a moderate illustration indeed, which should include not just people occupying public officials positions, political positions, but also people who are judges, who are in attorney services, prosecution services, who are in police, and so on, because those branches are extremely corrupt in Ukraine. Judicial branch is basically non-existing. It's a joke. It's completely corrupt. It's never served its purpose in the lifetime of Ukrainian society, Ukrainian nationhood. So there should be something done about this as well. Now, the elections that we have had, they are clearly giving this new government, which is emerging right now because of the coalition building process, a mandate to implement reforms and implement some harsh, perhaps even unpopular reforms and measures in Ukrainian politics. The Maidan, the recent Maidan that we have had, because as you know we have had two of those in a matter of about 10 years. So the first one was in 2004, and an Orange Revolution took place. And then the recent one was in the late 2013, and then through the first months of this year. The Maidan has clearly shown that people are fed up with the ways politics were being done in Ukraine in previous years. And not just about Yanukovych, but also with some governments that prevented him. But Yanukovych obviously has had, when he was in power, he really pushed that game of corruption in Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian economic life to the unseen heights. The corruption was so large-scale under Mr. Yanukovych that even for the country of Ukraine, where we kind of know a thing or two about corruption and we're used to it, that still was something appalling that really stunned many Ukrainians because of the high level and the large scale of that corruption that he implemented when he was in power. There is right now coalition building talks, as I say, in Ukraine. The Ukrainian executive is kind of divided because right now we are living under the political constitutional arrangement, which means that president controls a few things, including foreign policy, interior affairs, attorney service, defense, and so on. But the rest of the government functions are under responsibility of the prime minister. So very much it depends on the correlation of forces in the parliament, and the coalition is being emerging right now, and the government is being made. We have reasons to believe and hopes to believe that President Poroshenko and Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, it looks like Mr. Yatsenyuk will be able to stay in position of Prime Minister, will be able to work together successfully for the better of Ukrainian society, Ukrainian economics, Ukrainian state. Because we've had various experiences in our past. As you know, since the Orange Revolution and post-Orange years, we have had a lot of squabbling and quarreling between various members of the so-called Orange camp, particularly ex-President Yushchenko and ex-Prime Minister Tymoshenko, and it didn't work well. That chance 10 years ago was wasted on Ukraine. The momentum that we've had since the Orange Revolution It's gone. The window of opportunity is closed long time ago. So the people are afraid in Ukraine, indeed. People like myself, many people in Ukraine, whoever you talk to, that we might waste another opportunity. There is this Yushchenko syndrome, I call it, which is in the air. People are afraid that it's going to be all talk and no walk, and no actual policies, and no actual changes, and no actual reforms being implemented. It is on us, on Ukrainians primarily, of course, to push our government to do a good thing, to do the right thing, to implement those reforms, and to apply that pressure on our current Ukrainian government, and not let them to forget what was the message of Maidan, and what were the promises that people like Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk and others were making during the high time of Maidan in the last months of last year and first months of this year. Also, I think it is, and I'm going to go back to this a little later in my talk, the role of the West, so to speak, and this country, of the United States, in this Ukraine crisis. The role of the West is also to remind current Ukrainian government about the need to move forward. So there need to be a pressure, I think, applied domestically by Ukrainians on its own government, on their own government, and then also pressure from outside of Ukraine, from our friends here in the West, also to push Ukrainian decision makers in the right direction so that it wouldn't be taking too much time before implementing those reforms. What is happening right now in Ukraine is you have a very strong civil society. And you have a kind of weak and fledgling government, which is lagging behind in many ways, comparing to the activities of the civil society. The civil society has been made strong by Maidan, obviously. People finally had good reasons to believe that there is very much which is up to them, that they can actually achieve a lot if they are active in political life. Because prior to that, Ukraine was known for a lot of passivity in political life. A lot of people were absent really from political process. Not anymore. In various regions throughout Ukraine, the people were active and people were taking part in the political life. So there's a strong civil society, specifically because of this aggression against Ukraine with Crimea and events in Donetsk and Luhansk in the far eastern part of Ukraine. The people are mobilized. There is clearly a sense of consolidation within Ukrainian society. So that kind of mobilization and consolidation should be used indeed as a leverage on Ukrainian government to push it in the right direction, to make them not delay those reforms and move forward as country badly needs those reforms. Economics is a Achilles feet, is a weak point really of Ukraine today. We're having all these existential threats at the same moment: political life, economic life, and then aggression that we're facing. In economics, we are on the brink of default. The Ukrainian economy has not been doing well for a long time now, since this recent crisis started in 2008. Ukraine hasn't really drawn much good lessons from that crisis and hasn't been shown the capacity of improving its activity and its behavior in terms of its economic policy. The government of Yanukovych was very hurtful to Ukrainian economy indeed. I've mentioned to you the corruption, and also when Mr. Yanukovych fled, apparently he took a lot of money out of the state budget with him. So we're lacking that money now as well. Apparently there are rumors that some of that money being used now to fund separatists, so-called separatists in the eastern parts of Ukraine, to pay for their arms and so on. We wouldn't know that for sure right now, but that's what the rumors are saying. The crisis is deep. The war didn't help. Right now, of course, obviously we are in the process of spending more and more on military allocations and funding the military, which was underfunded, underfed, undertrained prior to those tragic events of the recent months when the Ukrainian military found itself in position to fight. You know, they are needed now to fight, and those people never were trained properly to do that. And the money that was allocated for years to support the Ukrainian military was mostly stolen. So you had a lot of generals who were having those nice dachas and villas around, being put up, definitely using that money, those money that I've been talking about, and yet you had soldiers and officers who were not practicing, who were not trained well enough, who were basically underfed. They went hungry. So it's now up on us, really, Ukrainian citizens, to work with our military and support our military, and that's what we are doing. the amount, the scale of volunteer activities in Ukrainian society is enormous these days. It's a unique case, I think, when the country consisting primarily and mostly of people who are not, frankly, quite not rich, and many of them who are just poor, yet are managing to get on a daily basis huge amounts of money through volunteer activities, through particular NGOs and so on, to deliver those money to buy arms, to buy provision, to buy food, to buy equipment, and bring it to the front line, risking their own lives, by the way, because the volunteers who would develop all of those items to the front line, they'll be shelled at as well, and they might be, some of them have been taken as hostages and prisoners of war and so on. So the economic situation in Ukraine is difficult. We are relying a lot on financial assistance which is coming from outside the world, particular countries, international financial monetary institutions. We are very grateful for that assistance. I'm not sure that average Ukrainian would be aware of the fact that his salary or her salary is being paid using the money being given by someone else outside of Ukraine. You might not know that. You might be thinking it's the Ukrainian government which is giving you this money, but without the financial assistance from outside of Ukraine, we wouldn't be able to survive. We are just barely holding on there, as the economy of Ukraine does. The financial assistance, though, should be definitely based on strict conditionality. I would like to stress that out. It's been happening for years that the money being given to Ukrainian decision makers and then just disappeared. In our unfortunate and shameful Ukrainian way of stealing the money and pocketing the money that were given for other purposes. So that should be a strict conditionality. The money that is given to Ukraine right now, it should be all measures being taken, all precautions being taken to prevent it from being put in the bottomless pit of corruption. You know, there should be a lot of control for each euro, for each dollar, or any other currency that is coming into Ukraine, the control and conditionality. With the final eventual aim, obviously, of Ukraine becoming again a sustainable country, a self-sustainable country in the economic sense of the word, because of obviously none of us, not Ukrainians and not people, our friends in the West, would like to see that going on forever. You know, basically Ukraine becoming some kind of an addict to Western financial assistance. No, we should be thinking obviously about Ukraine getting up on its own feet eventually and moving forward. But for now, obviously, we need that assistance, and that is forthcoming. That is forthcoming. The war that we're having right now, should we call it a war? Because of course there is a lot of playing with words these days, including you know, very cautious, super cautious, and with reason I can see why. Being actually an expert on studying U.S. foreign policy and U.S. policy towards Ukraine for years, and that's what I defended my dissertation on, was on that subject of U.S.-Ukraine relations. I can see why White House's countries is being super cautious these days and avoiding using terms and words like war or invasion, and using instead interference and incursions. Because if you say it is an invasion, it is a war, it is an aggression, then it also puts more responsibility on you to do something about it. If you're saying something else on a step lower, on a lower level, basically of intensity in definitions, then, well, what you're doing right now is probably enough. I would say it's still a war, it's still an aggression. Is that really the fact that some Ukrainians are shooting at other Ukrainians, other signs of civil war in Ukraine? Yes, they are. Obviously, that's what's going on in eastern Ukraine and the far east of regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. That's no doubt about it. But yet, even if we put aside for a moment the direct intervention of Russian regular troops in Ukrainian war, if we put aside for a moment a lot of the fighters and equipment that is coming across the border, if we put aside for a moment a lot of funding that is coming from Russia to fund those so-called separatist rebels, militants, whichever like you might call them, then you should also remember that the people who are now Ukrainian citizens and fighting Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military, those people have been brainwashed by Russian propaganda for years. Right? Some people in this country tend not to understand this properly, and they've been thinking about this ideological war that's been waged by Kremlin against Ukraine and the rest of the world. In fact, it's a new thing, it's a new phenomenon. It's only like weeks long or months long, it's only since Crimea or it's only since Maidan. No. This ideological warfare machine was put in place long time ago, because Mr. Putin, I think it's the first time I'm bringing up his name here today, he has something to do with it. He's been around for 15 years. He's been around for 15 years. And one of the first things he did, that he mentioned and he understood the importance and significance of information campaign and propaganda machine being well-oiled, well-funded. It's very efficient. It's run by very smart people. A lot of them getting their degrees in the best Western universities, so understand the mentality of the people here in the West, so that would be better be able to cater to people's understanding and perceptions here in the West as well. So in Ukraine you have millions of people who will be for years on a daily basis tuning in for Russian media coverage instead of receiving any other alternative information. Therefore these people, many millions of people in the east and south of Ukraine, including my hometown of Odessa, they've been living for years in a virtual world indeed. The information about what's going on right now, they are getting it not from actually walking out in the street and talking to people and seeing by their own eyes, with their own eyes, what's going on, but yet again through the video coverage that is being shown on particular TV stations. No wonder then that the so-called separatists, the first thing they did when they took over certain towns and cities in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions is they went after those TV towers. And they cut off all Ukrainian TV stations and they made it sure that it's only Russian TV stations that would be watchable, that would be delivered in the houses and apartments and the dwellings of the people in those two regions. So Russia is waging a war against Ukraine. Should we call it proxy war? Should we call it a hybrid war? I don't think that's particular objective of this particular talk here today is to go into these details. But it is a war. Some people already call it openly Russian-Ukrainian war. Other people call it, and I kind of like this definition, they call it a Ukrainian-Soviet war. Because in fact what Ukrainians are fighting today for is to have our chance to get away from that Soviet, post-Soviet, corrupt, Eurasian mentality, practices, economic practices, policies, and so on and so on. It's a difficult fight. It's a difficult fight. It reminds us of times back in the 1920s when a major and famous Ukrainian poet, Mykola Khvolyvy, came up with this slogan, "Get від Moskvy," get away from Moscow, get away from Moscow. It was understood, and even though Mr. Khvolyvy was a Ukrainian communist himself, but a national communist, this kind of branch of communists they were called at those times. It was understood at those times, and then, of course, 80 plus years later, we still understand that that's what we need to do. Not necessarily because Moscow is bad as a city, not necessarily because Russia is terrible as a state, and definitely not because we hate all Russians, but because the Moscow government right now, the Putin regime, the Putinism, this ugly regime that is in place right now in Russian Federation, is running its game and it's taken away the freedom of Russian population as well. So when we talk today about the future of Ukraine, we're also talking about the future of Russia. If Putinism is to win, then there is no modernization, then there is no improvement in quality of life, then there is no free TV or free newspapers, then definitely there is no free and fair elections, like it hasn't been in Russia actually for quite a long time right now, and the list goes on. So the fight, the struggle that is going on right now is not just about Ukraine, it's also about Russia. It's also about the future of Russian Federation and a chance and an opportunity for Russians themselves to be able to live in a free country and have an option of participating in running their own country. Now, the process, the peace process that we have right now, the Minsk process, so to speak, because the agreement was signed, I believe, in early September 5th, if not mistaken, is in a crisis, is basically a deadlocked process, specifically because of this recent so-called elections in those two self-proclaimed and unrecognized republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. That is clear violation of the Minsk agreement, because in the Minsk agreement you basically had a provision saying that Ukrainian territorial integrity should not be in question, and obviously it is in question because there is no talk even about Kyiv. Ukrainian government have been a partner in deciding the future of those two enclaves that are occupied now and beyond control of the Ukrainian government. The Crimea, of course, is taken over. I'm not going to spend too much time on Crimea. Clearly an annexation, clearly a takeover, nothing to do with a peaceful referendum or whatever. I think in this audience, the people who are following events in Ukraine, you would be aware of many arguments that we can put in support, in favor of this notion of Crimea basically just being incorporated by force, by military force into Russian Federation. Difficult subject for Ukraine right now. I mean, we understand that we are very limited in terms of numbers of ways and methods that we can use, in fact, in terms of trying to get Crimea back. Right now, I would say that perhaps the most clear scenario for the future, very distant future, when Crimea might be getting back to Ukraine would be a disintegration of Russian Federation. It doesn't happen to be, it doesn't look like it might be happening anytime soon. However, I think Mr. Putin is basically steering Russia towards abyss. And he's playing with lack of modernization. It's a dangerous game. He is playing with the nationalism and self-determination causes that is dangerous as well for Russian Federation, which is multi-ethnic as well. And but Crimea is definitely beyond our control right now. It is not recognized as a part of Russia by most of the international community. But what we can do to get it back, that's a different subject. I don't believe we have much in terms of options that we would have on our table in Ukraine these days. With Donetsk and Luhansk regions not entirely occupied, those two regions, some of the big portions of the land are still under control of the Ukrainian government, but big chunks are under control of those separatists. We still have some room for maneuver. It looks like this might be another Transnistria, another so-called frozen conflict. Many of my colleagues in my field, they don't like this term too much, the frozen conflict. They prefer this protracted conflict and so on. Whatever word you choose, it is similar to what is happening in Transnistria. Russians are not letting Ukraine to get those lands back. At the same time, it doesn't look like Moscow is interested in incorporating those regions into Russian Federation proper, like they did with Crimea. So the logic is probably there to have them as a kind of part of Ukraine, preventing Ukraine from moving freely, specifically in terms of moving towards EU, closer towards European Union, moving closer towards North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and so on. Basically some kind of a break that you can implement when you need to, when you would like to prevent Ukraine from doing something that Moscow would like our Ukrainian decision makers to do. We now have internally displaced persons in Ukraine, as you know, and outside of Ukraine some people went actually to the territory of Russia from the battleground areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. There are various estimates as to how many. That's a new phenomenon to us in Ukraine. We were not prepared for dealing with internally displaced persons, that's for sure. We have been observing at least several 100,000 people within Ukraine now who are trying to find their new homes and their new jobs and the schools for their kids in various parts of Ukraine right now, because the life in Donetsk and Luhansk regions is just not bearable for them. And I know many of my colleagues personally from Donetsk and Luhansk who escaped, luckily enough, those two regions. And they also looking for jobs right now. And they left everything they had, their apartments, their property, back in those two regions. And I'm just trying to keep track of who's where. Some in Kyiv, some in Uzhhorod, some in Lviv, some in Vinnytsia, and so on. It's tragic. It's tragic. The universities are occupied, really, and the people coming with machine guns to the rectors and presidents and deans and basically saying, swear your loyalty, your pledge of allegiance to the new government, or else. You know, at minimum you are out of your position, but it may be even more scarier, you know, because they've been knocking on the doors of people already who have been known as strong supporters of a unified Ukrainian state. And you should remember, though, that most sociological polls prior to the aggression have been showing that separatists, the supporters of separatist idea of succeeding away from Ukraine, perhaps becoming part of Russia, they've never enjoyed big numbers, impressive numbers anywhere in Ukraine. Even in Crimea, 41%. In Donetsk area, 33%. In my own Odessa region, 24%. That's a major sociological poll done by Democratic Initiatives and Kyiv International Institute for Sociology prior to the aggression, just on the eve of the aggression. So what does it tell you? That 2/3 of people in Donetsk do not want to live outside of Ukraine. They want to be part of Ukraine. And just one part was kind of hesitating. Is it changing right now? We wouldn't know, because there is a war going on there right now, so it's not very convenient situation now for sociologists to go there and do their sociological polling right now. But I assume a lot of people are just feeling that they are living under occupation there. That's what's going on with war. The ceasefire is not working. The fighting is goes on. The head of Donetsk People's Republic, Mr. Zakharchenko, he's been talking other day, I think a couple of weeks ago, that since ceasefire been signed, we've taken over 38 towns. So that's kind of ceasefire which is going on. Ukrainian military is retreating, is not returning fire, and separatists and their Russian enablers basically, and there are still people who say Russian regular troops are still there. They are on advance. They are on offensive. The Donetsk airport is in ruins right now. Just 2 years ago, it was a completely new airport. A lot of money being invested. We've been hosting the soccer championship, European Soccer Championship in 2012. That's why we have this new airport. Sergei Prokofiev Airport in Donetsk is in ruins right now. Ukrainian troops are still holding to the airport, and there is heavy fighting there. There is a heavy fighting around the city of Mariupol on the coast of Azov Sea, where we don't know what the next step of the separatists and the Russian troops will be. There are reasons to suspect that they might be willing to take Mariupol over. You see, we are all in this business of guessing what Mr. Putin is up to right now. There is no clear indication that anyone would know what is his strategy. He seems to be moving in tactical ways quite often, doing one step and then reassessing situation and taking reactions and seeing what's going on, and then deciding what happens next. And one thing that is very important for us to understand, I believe, is that when he sees weakness, when he sees softness, when he sees indecisiveness, when he sees only a willingness to talk and not actually to do anything for real, then he moves on. Then he moves in, then he does more, then he's more aggressive, then he's more emboldened. And here I come to the final block, the thematic block within my presentation here today, which is dealing with how people here in the West, I think, should perceive this Ukraine crisis, this Russian-Ukraine war, this aggression which Mr. Putin has come up with in recent months. There's a lot of debate right now. Is there a new Cold War on the horizon? I would argue there is a Cold War going on right now already. Mr. Putin is waging that Cold War. He's also waging the hot war against Ukraine, but with regard to the other countries out in the Russian immediate periphery, but also in Europe and also US, it's already a Cold War full speed ahead. I believe so. Is that a unilateral one so far? Because the West is really not responding. The sanctions that have been applied against Russia, that's not kind of a response that we were looking for. The sanctions is probably a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. And also we're hearing that they are not even covering the entire sectors of Russian economy. They are not comprehensive. There are many loopholes. Many large corporations here in the West, I'm afraid, are finding ways to work with Russians around those sanctions. And the sanctions, we should remember, yes, they're punitive. They're punitive, but they're not intent to punish Russian population, Russian people. They intend to alter the behavior of the ruling regime in Russia, Mr. Putin and his inner circle. That is a very important thing that we should probably understand here when we talk about sanctions. When sanctions are being applied, does it mean that people here in the West or leaders of European countries or United States want for Russians to be hungry or underfed or starving or something? No, of course not. Of course not. They understand that Mr. Putin is the worst enemy of Russian people himself. And they're working with those sanctions against Putin and his inner circle. Now, but the sanctions, as I said, are probably not enough. Another thing which should be used is clearly put an end to acceptance of Mr. Putin at various world international forums. I think that the initial reaction of G8 becoming like it was prior to those events, again G7, Russia excluded, was a step in the right direction. I believe that inviting Mr. Putin to attend G20 meeting next week in Australia was a step in the wrong direction. And I know there is a lot of uproar, really, and outrage in Australia, specifically about Mr. Putin being invited because dozens and dozens of Australians died in Malaysian Flight 17, which we still have a lot of reasons to believe was shot down by separatists with weapons provided by Russian military. We don't have a final proof of that, but there are many reasons to believe that's exactly what happened. So pretending like nothing happened, like Mr. Putin is just one of us, you know, that we can still do handshakes and smiles and photo ops and so on, that's a wrong message, clearly the wrong message that can be sent at this difficult, crucial time to Mr. Putin. And finally, I believe that the right way to proceed is for various friends of Ukraine outside of Ukraine's borders is to help us and provide us some arms. What kind of arms? That could be debated and discussed. We might need defensive arms, we might even appreciate some non-lethal supply for our military, because our military is really understaffed and really doesn't have enough to fight the war. Would the reason for supplying arms to Ukrainian military be that Ukraine wins the war against Russia? No. No, that's not possible. Ukraine could not win an all-out, full-scale war vis-a-vis Russia. But that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is for Ukraine to be armed, to be better prepared to not lose the war against Russia, to make further advances and incursions into Ukraine by Russian forces and pro-Russian forces more costly. It's not that Mr. Putin really cares about those lives of Russian soldiers and officers who died in Ukraine, and we're getting reports about them being in massive numbers, really. But he would probably reconsider if he would know for sure that the further advances within Ukraine, if he's planning those indeed, would cost him a lot in money and in human personnel, human life, and military, Russian military as well. So he might reconsider. With Putin, the logic of escalation versus de-escalation, I'm sure, is working in such way that when he sees weakness, then when he sees rhetorics, then when he sees red lines being drawn and not really supplemented by actual deeds and actual policies, he moves on. He's emboldened. People outside of Ukrainian borders are in panic right now. People in Baltics are panicking. People are scared in countries like Poland, in Moldova, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, specifically in northern Kazakhstan, because you have a lot of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in northern Kazakhstan. And as you know, Mr. Putin is basically saying that he's protecting Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. And I myself been a Russian speaker from Odessa, or my friends are Russian speakers from Odessa. I have Russian blood in myself as well. You know, and I've never felt, and my friends, we've never felt persecuted or discriminated against. It's all a myth. It's all really a myth. It's only an excuse that Mr. Putin came up with for his aggression. And he might use it with Latvia, where you have 50% of those who are not ethnic Latvians. He might use it against Kazakhstan and other places as well. And people beyond the post-Soviet space are scared right now. Mr. Putin is in scare tactics. So unless he's shown that there is a clear resolve, that there is clear readiness to do something about his aggression, he's going to go on. He's emboldened, he's encouraged by his initial success. He sees him winning this little war against Ukraine. And Ukraine is just a battleground, just a minor battleground to him. For now, he might open new front lines and new directions and dimensions for his invasion. His invasion is also an ideological one. He's trying to undermine European integration process. He's trying to undermine Euro-Atlantic process. With European process, who is Mr. Putin's friends, his best friends in many European countries these days? Eurosceptics, radicals on both extreme left and extreme right, who've been, ironically enough, happily in bed together since all this thing started. And you have people coming, and you have people embracing Mr. Putin, like Madame Le Pen in France, and UKIP in party of United Kingdom Independence Party, and in the United Kingdom, and you have Jobbik, super radical nationalist party in Hungary, and many others coming and saying, "Oh, Mr. Putin is a great guy. He's doing what he was what he's supposed to be doing. We need to understand him. This wave of Russia understanders and Putin understanders is huge. It's less visible so in this country, but it's quite visible in Europe. You can feel it. And that's a dangerous thing, because ideologically, why is Mr. Putin so appealing to extreme right? Well, because he's talking about conservatism. His ideology and mindset is extremely retrograde. He is basing a lot of things that he is saying on this idea of rotten, inefficient Western liberalism. He's big on gay bashing. A lot of people in Europe like that. And as you know, he's implemented in his own country some very strict anti-gay laws. So he's very appealing to this conservative ultranationalist forces around the globe, in fact. With left-wingers, it's a little bit more complicated. I believe in most cases it's just an inertia of the times of a previous Cold War, when the Soviet Union and communist ideology were seen as some kind of an opponent, an alternative to Western imperialist, capitalist warmongering and profiteering and so on. Right now it's beyond me how people, some people who are of left views, or leftist views here in the West would still see it this way, because the ugly kleptocratic oligarchic regime that Putin has put in place in Russia is much more imperialistic, is much more not caring about ordinary people than any other country here in the West. You know, so how can you still subscribe to this logic of us being supporting Mr. Putin because he is opposing that imperialist West? I mean, it just doesn't, this argument just doesn't live through the test of reality. But still some people believe this. So what needs to be done in the coming weeks and months and years, if you're here in the West? Maintain the sanctions, provide financial to Ukraine for a time being at least, give Ukrainians some arms so they can better defend themselves, and also perhaps come up with new ideas. Here in this country there is a bill which is sitting on the Capitol Hill in Congress, which is called Freedom Support Act, Ukraine Freedom Support Act, which by the way includes also Georgia and Moldova. It's a great bill. I hope it would be passing through the Congress and also coming to the desk of the President and be supported by President eventually. It's calling for Ukraine to be getting status of major US non-NATO ally. It is also calling for this country to be providing some arms support to Ukraine and many other good things. And like I said, it also has a regional view. It's not just focused on Ukraine. It's really focused on many other countries that need support of this of the United States government around the post-Soviet space. So that would be a step in the right direction. So far, we've been hearing that the presidential administration in this country is not enthusiastic about this law and not enthusiastic about this idea of giving this major non-NATO US ally status to Ukraine. But things might change. I think they might evolve. I think people here in this country should understand that this is not just about Ukraine. This is about values that this country is based on, that the Western civilization is based upon. It's about the future of major allies of the United States and Europe and elsewhere. It's about dictators around the world being emboldened by seeing what Mr. Putin is doing right now and not being stopped and not being prevented from doing what he's doing. So, like I'm saying, it goes much beyond what is happening to my home country of Ukraine. And I believe that we might be able in Ukraine to live through these difficult times, including with help and assistance coming from outside, from our friends in the West, specifically here in this country. But also people outside of the post-Soviet space should understand that difficult times have arrived. And new challenges are here. And for these new drastic challenges, there need to be a new thinking, and there need to be a preparedness to show resolve, and to get back to this idea of a coherent, unified Euro-Atlantic community, and re-energize NATO. That is what is needed, because NATO was almost dissolved when the Cold War was over, then it was kept, then for years people basically didn't know what to do with it, and there was lack of understanding, and now you know what to do with it. You just need to tune it a little bit better So it would be again prepared to face that challenge that current aggressive behavior of Russian Putin government is presenting us with. Thank you.
We have time for some questions and discussion, and I'll call on people as they raise their hands. Start with you.
Professor, how do you explain the phenomenon of Odessa?
Right.
How do you avoid, how your city avoid this scenario that Putin
Right.
so successfully put in Donetsk and Luhansk?
Right, that's a great question. Should I still speak in microphone or?
Did everyone hear?
Yes.
the
No.
question?
Questions.
So the question is, how does our speaker see the phenomenon, what happened in Odessa as well as in Lugansk and Donetsk? How does he interpret those developments?
Well, yeah, the way I understood the question is that how Odessa is different from Luhansk and Donetsk in many ways, considering that indeed we also had been part of so-called Novorossiya. You know, there was a lot of talk about this new Russia concept that Mr. Putin is coming up with. Ironically enough, he's often using it to explain what's going on in Donetsk and Luhansk, and those two regions have never been part of Novorossiya, of New Russia. Only Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson, and Crimea, and this piece of land, this stretch of land on the northern littoral of the Black Sea in the south of Ukraine, and also all the way to Caucasus, they were historically known as Novorossiya. But anyway, indeed, the question was like, how come the cities that are Russian-speaking, where you had a sizable chunk of population who had some pro-Russian views, cities like Kharkiv, cities like Dnipropetrovsk, cities like Odessa or Kherson or Mykolaiv, how are they not becoming another Donetsk and Luhansk? Well, you see, the people don't like seeing their country being attacked. You know, Odessa, we definitely had pro-Yanukovych electorate for years. People voted for Mr. Yanukovych in his party regions, all the way up to like 75%, sometimes 2/3 of the city. But that's been changing. Since Maidan, people didn't like seeing on TV screens this youth, the students being beaten brutally, just because they thought that Mr. Yanukovych made a mistake of not signing association agreement with the European Union. Then people didn't like our special forces shooting at demonstrators and killing a lot of them, almost 100. Then people didn't like Crimea taken over. So it's a logic of living in a country and having some loyalty and not being happy about this country being attacked. So in Odessa right now, the numbers of people who are still holding some sort of a Russia understanding or pro-Russian attitudes is shrinking, and the number of people who are strongly in support of a unified, strong Ukraine and the need to come up with whatever we might do to get back and push back, you know, is growing. Is growing. And the same thing around east and the south of Ukraine. This logic, this tired stereotype of Ukraine divided into west and east is not working right now. First of all, it's never been east, it's been east and south, and then also within east and the south there are various variables, I would say, a lot of variables. In fact, there are a lot of people who are fighting this war right now on the front lines against this pro-Russian separatists and Russian troops who are coming from those particular regions. There is a stereotype here outside of Ukraine that a lot of Western Ukrainians, nationalists like from Halishina, are coming to fight those wars. No. Most people are coming from Cherkasy, from Poltava, from Kharkiv region, from Kherson region, because they understand if Putin moves on, then their own towns and lands and cities are next. So they're basically defending their home ground, all right? That's why you have a lot of people, if you hear interviews with them, fighting on the front lines, most of them use Russian language. Most of them ethnic Russians. But like in Odessa as well, there is a phenomenon, there are millions of people in Ukraine who are ethnic Russians or Russian-speaking, but strong patriots of the Ukrainian state. And that is coming to the fore right now. And we're seeing this happening, and that's why Odessa is the Ukrainian city right now. And I am kind of prudent and confident that it's going to be like that, unless there is a direct invasion into our land as well. Yes. I'll try to be brief because I can see.
My question is very simple.
Right.
You should be defeating the enemy by hitting his weak points.
Yeah.
Russia economy depends on gas and oil.
Right.
If we hit that, the 1/3 of the economy of Russia will die. There's not enough money to feed that state.
Right.
In Ukraine, there are two big places where there's a big underground of gas in Halachina, the west side, and some in Donetsk region. And why don't you already started the fracking to big that to bring that gas to the forefront? That would be very, very big hit for Russia.
I agree with you absolutely, and I'll just answer briefly that unfortunately some of the most rich in shale gas areas are being taken by Russia away from us. We had a lot of those in Crimea and also in eastern Ukraine. So there are still some left. There are still some left, and they should be developed and explored. And you're quite right, you are. I mean, the whole thing of dependence on energy coming from Russia for years and not doing enough to diversify sources of supply and dimensions of energy supply has been inexcusable. And I think to a large extent it's been a work of fifth column within Ukraine for years. But we are exploring this. Exploring this.
Ukrainian,
let's go on. Let's give others a chance to ask
we can talk
questions.
after,
Over here. Yeah.
Why do you think that Putin is creating this conflict? Do you have any idea what his innermost motivations are? Is that, for instance, to help consolidate power at home?
That's one as well. Definitely he likes his high ratings and he's enjoying them for now. They might drop eventually, but for now, of course, obviously because of him being victorious and in Ukraine, he's having these high ratings. Also, his grand project, obviously, his big ambition is to recreate some kind of a new Soviet Union or new Russian Empire, not to the extent to incorporate all those lands, the post-Soviet republics, into Russian Federation, but clearly to create some empire. He never made a secret that he didn't like dissolution of Soviet Union. He called it the worst tragedy of his life, the most tragic thing he ever saw. So he's basically trying to undo what happened back in 1991. And then also he is playing this game with the West. You know, he's been saying we are all for this multipolar world, and America's not listening. And there you go. We're going to show you that we are capable of doing certain things and winning some wars, and we're going to be using whatever methods and means we have in our hands. If that be military means, that's fine with us. Because here in the West, people are saying what Putin is doing is mid-19th century stuff, and we are living in 21st century, but Putin is saying, well, I don't care. I'm in 21st century, that's my understanding what I can do in this 21st century. So there are many motivations, really, geopolitical, ideological, and it doesn't stop on Ukraine, really, only in terms of what he's trying to do.
Can you briefly mention or say what you think about Budapest Agreement? Right. Actually, there is no discussion practically in this country, right, and even you didn't mention, which right, is really important. United States practically walk away. So what kind of consequences for the whole world? Right. How other country can trust all these other agreements? If
It's a great question. Actually, I'm sure there's going to be one of those questions tomorrow also in my talk with the students here, because I'm going to be talking about the lessons of the Ukraine crisis for the global international relations. The Budapest Agreement of 1994, which basically provided Ukraine with some assurances, security assurances, when Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in its territory that we have inherited from former Soviet Union. We have had more than 1,700 nuclear warheads on Ukrainian soil at some point, automatically becoming the nuclear power number 3 after US and Russia. We gave up those weapons. There was an agreement signed. Russia signed it, Great Britain as well, United States. Similar memorandums were signed actually by 2 other nuclear powers, French and China as well. Well, those assurances were always kind of vague. They were not really concrete. We've been complaining about them being assurances, not guarantees. In the text of Budapest Memorandum, basically, there was a talk that if Ukraine is attacked, then the signatories of that document are to call it to the attention of international community, bring it to the attention of the United Nations, for example. And that's been done. That's been done. You know, so unfortunately, it's not only a matter of our friends, including those in the United Kingdom and here in the US, who didn't do much, but also in terms of the whole document not being written in such a way that we would be confident that we'll be receiving some assistance if something happens like it's happening right now. So that's my point of view. So I wouldn't really put too much blame on say, London or Washington for not doing enough. In fact, diplomats of both countries are doing a lot to help Ukraine right now.
Back there, it's not another.
Katarzyna Stokłosa, University of Southern Denmark. Thanks a lot for your speech. What I really liked was the end of your speech, that this is not only about Ukraine, this is about democracy, this is about dictatorships, and this is about our common values. And this is what I wanted to ask you about. How can we transform our common Western European and Northern American values through the societies who are not ready to accept these values? And the last results have shown that Putin until now has a really strong influence on the Russian society.
Right.
So how it's possible? It's the first question. And the second one, do you think that will be possible that we'll have in the Ukraine the development like in the 80s in Poland, solidarity movement?
Right.
When I took this to a circle like this in northern Germany, and participants were inhabitants of northern German city, but from Russia and from Ukraine, they told me, you are defending these fascists and you don't know nothing about Ukraine. I'm from Poland originally, but this is a topic of my research. But they wanted to show me, no, they are not the points of view, not their values I would like to defend. So, you know, how can we make our universal democratic values and transform to other societies?
Right. It's a huge question, obviously loaded one. Well, I believe Ukrainians should be appreciating those same values that people are here in the West. I've been believing this for years now, and I don't believe in various regional adaptations and versions of, let's say, human rights or democracy, which works here but doesn't work there. I believe in the universal character of human rights and democratic values. I think Ukrainians have shown that we don't like, for example, when the results of elections being stolen, when there is fraud, and there is a falsification. We showed it back in 2004. So basically, Ukrainians in many ways are not much different from Europeans. And I think it's a very important instrument as well for the European Union to continue to work with Ukraine, even though EU itself finds itself in crisis. But there is an association agreement which opens a lot of mechanisms for the European Union to work with Ukraine in terms of increasing this level of understanding what European values are for Ukrainians and by Ukrainians. So I believe that is very promising as well. And then in terms of, you've been mentioning that some people told you that that you don't understand what's going on in Ukraine. Well, the diaspora people, the communities, post-Soviet communities, ex-Russian, ex-Ukrainian, they are split themselves about what's going on in Ukraine. And it's all depending on what's your source of information. I mean, right now we're having just a superb example of how strong is the grip of information. So I've been talking to some of my friends and whom I know here in this country, and they're divided just like people in Ukraine are divided in these events. Some are watching Russian TV, they're getting their understanding of what's going on from there. Some are watching something else, reading internet, reading books, reading articles, they're getting absolutely different attitude to what's going on there. So people are divided outside of Ukraine on what's going on in Ukraine, so that's just a matter, I think, just the nature of this crisis.
There.
The U.S. Attorney's Office just opened a probe against, I believe, Gennady Timchenko, who's an ally, he's a billionaire, an ally of Putin. And the Kremlin seems to be really upset by this. I mean, it's probably an effective tool. Why is that? Why does Putin care what happens to some billionaire?
Well, he's in the inner circle. Well, I mean, Mr. Timchenko is definitely one of the, if not the right hand of Mr. Putin, then clearly one of those hands, very important hands to Mr. Putin. The probe by Attorney General here, I don't know, I'm not sure how effective that would be. I have my reasons to believe that many of the people in the inner circle of Putin were prepared for sanctions, individual targeted sanctions, and their account being frozen. In fact, I remember someone told me that, that there was information that even when Mr. Putin returned to his presidential position a couple of years ago, he said, be prepared for sanctions, do not even have any accounts outside, or clearly not in European countries, clearly not in the US, find other ways to hide your money and so on. So I don't know. I think it's a matter of a personal maybe grievance and anger that Mr. Putin is displaying, but I wouldn't believe that it's really that it is really hurting Mr. Timchenko or anyone in Putin's inner circle. But that's one of the mechanisms you can use, though. I mean, there could be a diverse, I think, instrumentarium really of what you can use to effect that regime which is in power, including opening such cases.
In the discussion of world geopolitical chessboard, the question that often comes up is what is the U.S. relationship to not just Russia but China? And what's happened from the sanctions is that Russia has turned strongly to expand its relation with China. I was in China 2 weeks ago giving a talk, and that was a story that was concurred to by Chinese I talked to, and proud by Russians I talked to, that this was a good thing for them. It's driven partly by the sanctions, which are also hurting the European economy and are considered dangerous to Russia, and the ruble has been falling. I'm wondering what you think about this direction. Would the petrodollar, which is the strength that the U.S. has gained by having oil traded in dollars, be destroyed by Russia accepting and China going along with using things other than dollars for their transactions, and actively, and I think Putin is actively trying to avoid using dollars, and it's maybe outside your field to push too hard on where the Russian ruble is going, which is down, the European euro, which is down, and the dollar, which surprisingly in this consideration is up. But I'm wondering if you have any opinions about the future.
It's a big question, obviously. I think that China is a big winner in all of this, obviously, whatever happens. They're just enjoying themselves right now and getting big benefits out of it and profits out of it, no doubt about it. In terms of Russia turning towards China, I don't think there's I think there is a limit to what Russia can do because it's a European country as well. It's a Eurasian country, obviously, but a lot of Russian orientation has been for years towards Europe as well. And Russia depends on Europe in many ways, and Europe depends on Russia, as you know. So I think that Russians would not be able to compensate for the loss of European market with dealing with China. The recent, what I'm hearing is that the recent agreement that they have signed with Chinese is basically not profitable for Russia whatsoever. They're almost selling their energy supplies to China at the level which is almost the level of what it costs Russia to excavate all of this from their lands. So it's more of a geopolitical signal to the West. Oh, look, we can turn to China, but they cannot really, because they need those consumers of natural gas in Germany and France and so on, many other countries and so on. There is a limit to it. And also in Kremlin, I think they're not stupid enough. I mean, they should understand that Beijing is going to be a big brother in all this game, you know. And Russians wouldn't probably like to be a corollary, just a second-class citizen working with China and under Chinese guidance. So they're not gonna find too much in that Chinese direction, I think.
And what about these planes from Russia that seem to be flying outside their space a lot lately? Do you have any opinion?
No, I'm not. I have an opinion. Yes, he's pushing, he's provoking. I mean, he's trying to test you guys. I mean, he's obviously in the business of provoking NATO. One thing that could happen to NATO, it could be re-energized and get stronger. But another thing could be that Mr. Putin will be capable and successful in showing that NATO is hollow, inefficient, and not capable of defending itself and allies and so on. And he might be, I mean, Putin, mad enough to attack, say, one of those 3 Baltic states, just to show that anyone else outside of those 3 states would not be capable of defending them and therefore undermining NATO. And that would be a big, big win for Mr. Putin if he would be able to show that NATO is inefficient, out of business, out of the game. And I think that's what he's trying to do. And that's why he's having all these airplanes. He's in this, he's on the roll. You know, he's provoking people. You know, he's really enjoying this game. He's playing the scare tactics. You know, he's mentioning in every second of his speech, he would be reminding everyone that Russia's nuclear power, like someone forgot about that. But that's what he's doing. You know, he's trying to scare anyone into submission, including the West, basically saying, don't you mess with us, don't you even think about supporting Ukraine, because we are a big power. You can see that now.
Alan, Professor Reed.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I was curious or interested in your comments about the South and Odessa and Mariupol, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more why the features that you described in describing the South seem not to be so evident in the East. And certainly we would not take seriously the kinds of elections that have been held, referenda that have been held in Donetsk and Luhansk as being free and fair, and yet I think it probably is the case that there is a lot of support for Russia, for independence, for autonomy. And so the question is, why is that? And maybe the deeper question is there a viable Ukrainian nation state that includes those regions?
I think there is, and I think that we definitely should be taking those elections as serious. And they've been held with a lot of violations. That's what we've been hearing. There haven't been really observers. There were few Mr. Putin's favorites from Europe coming from various political parties who were observing. And in fact, there was even a report in the Russian press that OSCE, Organization of Security Cooperation of Europe, came to observe those elections. That wasn't true. In fact, it turns out there was a new organization which was created, which was some kind of ASCE instead of OSCE, specifically to confuse people, right, and mislead people about what's going on. And that new organization was observing, presumably, those allegedly was observing those elections. There were so many, you know, violations. I wouldn't be even taking those serious. And but though there is a propaganda war going on, and obviously every time that someone dies in Luhansk and Donetsk, people have been shown some proof, so to speak, on the television that it's the Ukrainian military which is showing. And that is not to say that perhaps there have been some collateral damage as well from the actions of the Ukrainian military. That's how it goes. That's how it happens with urban warfare. You know, you're receiving some fire, you're returning fire. If the source of the fire is in a big apartment building where people live, that's what happens, you know. And we can be reminded of the cases, similar cases, like how many civilians have been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, or, say, Israeli Defense Forces, which are very sophisticated, well-trained, well-prepared, and how many civilians died in the Gaza operation. So that's what happens when you have this urban warfare, unfortunately. And people being shown in the region, and they're trying to provoke this backlash against Ukraine. But I think it could be reversed. If those lands be liberated, that could be reversed. In some of those lands and towns that have been retaken by Ukrainian military, you had people in massive numbers coming out in the streets with Ukrainian flags and flowers and everything. So those relations, they could be reinforced, I think, and we can still be thinking about reintegrating those regions back to Ukraine if they are freed. And I'm afraid that for now, there is only one way to free them is by military force. But Ukrainian leaders are definitely hesitating, and decision-makers hesitating in terms of whether we should be doing that. If we are willing even or capable of winning this little war. Ukrainian public is split on this right now. There are many people who are blaming Poroshenko for signing the ceasefire, President Poroshenko, for signing the agreement on ceasefire. And there are many saying that we have lost so many lives already. We can perhaps, tragic way of thinking about this, lose even more. But at least we will be able to liberate those Ukrainian lands and reinforce our territorial integrity. Yes.
Okay. Right. Could you say something about the comments of Polish former foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, about Putin's talk with the former Polish president Tusk? And to go from that forward, what do you think about the political solution proposed for Ukraine in terms of federalization, Finlandization, or even a combination of both, federalization followed by Finlandization?
Well, first of all, on Sikorski remarks, I think that since he made these remarks, presumably he's been saying that he wasn't understood properly and so on, he wasn't in the room, something like that. And I don't think that Putin is naive enough to offer Polish leadership this, because it's been known for years that Poland is a big friend of Ukraine, so they wouldn't be considering this kind of opportunity of dividing Ukraine like it was done many times over centuries, obviously, but that's different circumstances right now. It's not 16th, 17th, or 18th century anymore, so I don't think that Putin maybe he was a bad joke. After all, he is known for bad jokes, so, you know. Yes. And the second question was on federalism. Well, there is a lot of need for decentralization, and that's what's going on right now in Ukraine, and that should be part of the reforms. But federalization, that's a bad recipe, obviously, for Ukraine right now. If we were to have this talk 10 years ago, I would say federalism is a good idea. But right now, of course, if we proceed along the road of federalization, that would be meaning that we're moving towards disintegration of Ukrainian state. And that's not a good idea. Yeah, federalization is another thing. You know, yes, indeed, there are some people who are suggesting that Ukraine should be made a permanently neutral state, like Finland was during the times of World War, or like Austria was after the Second World War. I think it's a very dangerous suggestion because, first of all, it definitely takes agency away from us Ukrainians. It undermines the whole principle of sovereignty of nations and territorial integrity and so on. But also it's not going to work because if Budapest Memorandum didn't work and Russia didn't respect it, why would any other new treaty, let's say, on permanent neutrality of Ukraine be working? And what are the mechanisms to enforce it? I mean, it's just beyond comprehension how naive sometimes are those folks who are now making these ideas floating around. And they're definitely playing to the tune of Kremlin. There's one person who's here.
Thank you. I have to say I find your attitude incredibly reckless from the perspective of the United States behavior. Ever since this crisis started, the position of basically all leaders in the United States is Putin is like worse than 1,000 Stalins, Hitlers, etc. combined. And it's an extremely, they have marginalized Putin in every respect. Beyond that, Putin, as you admit yourself, and he's got what, 90% approval rating. You say you're worried about the future Russians. The Russians are strongly behind Putin. What does Putin gain by coming to heel under the will of the U.S.? He has nothing to gain. So he's in a position where he only loses if he caves to the West. Beyond which, NATO, you say NATO fell apart after the Soviet Union fell. In fact, NATO kept accreting more and surrounded him, and NATO's been accreting.
What's the question?
Well, it's more that I find the attitude here in general. Okay, here's my question. Should we consider going as far as global thermonuclear war to protect? Well, when you push it, just a second. This is important. When you push it in this way, and you claim to you speak as if you see right inside Putin's mind. I don't think you know it. So you know this is how you escalate.
Let's get the question.
This is how you escalate
question,
war.
sir.
How are you going to? What do you do when Putin calls your bluff? And we have this escalation back and forth until we have fighting between NATO troops and Russians, and then you have the possibility of nuclear war. So it's something you should think about before you... Be careful about what you wish for, people.
So let's Putin take over.
Well, I believe that it works differently with Putin. I think I've said it in my talk. If you are prudent, if you are confident, if you're showing resolve, if you're showing strength, he will back off. He will step back. That's how it works with him.
That's a gamble.
That's a gamble. That's a gamble. The war politics is a big gamble.
So what do you suggest? To give in the whole Europe to Putin, or what? Maybe he will come here. You will enjoy him.
The next question, please.
I want to ask about a non-military approach. The price of oil has dropped about a third in the last month or so. I think with the complicity of the Saudis for the purpose of getting the Iranians out of Syria, but it has an extremely large economic impact on Russia. Maybe the Saudis are the best ally for the Ukraine because the Russians cannot make oil as cheaply as the Saudis can.
Absolutely. Well, the Saudis are friends of Ukraine, obviously, but I think this dropping of oil prices should be around for a long time before they actually start feeling it in Russia. They are adjusting some of their plans and figures in their planning, economic planning and so on in Russia. But the sanctions as well, the trick with sanctions, they need to be in place for a long time before they become biting. And right now I'm not sure if Putin is and his inner circle are feeling the effect of those sanctions. If those oil prices stay down low for a long time, that could be a serious hit on Russian interests. And that could indeed, you're right, that could indeed, without any military options, be a way to alter his behavior, or at least make him more cautious and less aggressive and less reckless.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'll be brief.
Oh.
I have a question about the economy. How does Ukraine turn the economy around to a growth economy that 5 years from now actually can support itself, or 10 years from now?
Ukraine has been a growth economy for a number of years prior to the crisis struck in 2008. We've been showing some good figures actually in developing our economy. But then there was a crisis, and then there was Maidan, and now there is a war. So I think if we kind of get rid of those challenges, eventually we'll be able to be back on the road and back on track in terms of economic development.
How?
Mikita Safronenko, Ukraine.
This will be the last question.
Yeah, Ukrainian American Coordination Council. So, Professor, you mentioned during your speech that it's not only about Ukraine, it's also about Russia. So, what should happen in Russia? So, then Russian people will rise against Putin and do something. What should happen?
Well, the deterioration of the economic situation for one. Right now, I think that's the only thing. That if indeed the sanctions become so biting that the levels, standard of living would go down, that would be a very important thing for Russians indeed. Because they're kind of now drunk with this national chauvinistic kind of ideas and imperialistic, jingoistic ideas. But drunkenness goes away, and then comes hangover. You know, and there are many Russians who will be feeling this hangover soon, I think, because they'll be seeing the results of the sanctions and the bluff and the adventurism that Putin is displaying. So I believe that's the only way, because after all it's a bargain, it's a grand contract that Putin has with populace. Well, you trust me, I run this country, we like it, but you're getting some financial kickback from what I'm doing. And when those kickbacks are disappearing, you know, when those benefits and profits to the ordinary folks disappearing, you know, they become unhappy about what's going on. And there are many people in Russia who are unhappy about the direction for this country, for Russia, in the future. They kind of coalescing around Putin in terms of foreign policy, but when it comes to issues of modernization, democratization, and other, in my own meetings, even with people in Russia, many of them are not happy about what's going on, and his cult of personality, among other things as well.
Right. I think we've had a very productive and interesting discussion, and I would like to express thanks on behalf of